As a pastor, I'm under a certain professional constraint to not only speak the truth, but to try to speak the truth in love. And so I'm going to try to say this in the most loving way that I possibly can. Our president is dangerously stupid. The decision he announced on Thursday to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord was ignorant on so many levels that it is sincerely very difficult to know where to begin. Both news programs and comedians have been wagging their heads all week saying that the United States now joins only Syria and Nicaragua as the only nations in the world that are not signed on to this non-binding agreement that really, honestly, it just makes very modest proposals about how we might save our planet from global suicide. But I've got to speak up in defense of Nicaragua. And sure, Syria is deeply mired in a lethal civil war, and they're not making good decisions about absolutely anything. But journalists and talk show hosts have made fun of our suddenly being grouped with Nicaragua, such a primitive place as that. Well, that isn't what's going on here at all. We are not a peer of Nicaragua. Nicaragua did not sign on to the Paris Climate Agreement because they knew it didn't go far enough. They sent delegations to Paris to argue that it needs to be much stronger and it needs to be a binding agreement because Nicaragua doesn't produce coal. Nicaragua doesn't produce oil. Nicaragua doesn't have any natural gas. For the most part, Nicaragua was turned into a slave colony by Europe and the United States, and we turned it into an agricultural colony that grew our bananas, our oranges, our coffee beans, sugar cane, and excellent cigar tobacco. Most of the farms there are owned by foreigners. There's very few Nicaraguans, 5 families, that profit from these industries. But those crops are no longer in demand the way that they were. The growth industry in Nicaragua is now sweatshops that are being built by and owned by South Korea. Now, when an emerging economy like South Korea says, you know what, we can get more cheaper labor in Nicaragua than we can get in South Korea, you got to understand that things are going really badly. I know some of the people that work in those sweatshops, and they work 14-hour days in absolutely miserable, sweltering heat. My friends, my brothers and sisters in Nicaragua are trying to work their way out of 2 centuries of imposed poverty and slavery, but even they know very well what Europeans and Americans have done to their environment. We put chemical plants in Nicaragua and Kodak dumped chemicals into the lake that people were drinking out of. I know people who have died young from the chemicals that we dumped in Nicaragua. So they're not signing on to the Paris Accord is not because they're an uninformed, ignorant third world country. It's because they're 100 times more sophisticated than we are. And if journalists and comedians want to make fun of Manuel Ortega for being the president of a poor third world country, I need to be able to say clearly that he is an intellectual and moral giant compared to the current resident of the White House in the United States. Like most thinking people, and even some of the dumber rocks in my vegetable garden, I was furious about what Trump announced on Thursday afternoon. But there are mitigating considerations. The first being, as the Nicaraguan government pointed out, the Paris Agreement was a fairly toothless accord that was little more than a modest step in the right direction. When it was passed, you didn't hear a lot of jubilation. I was one of the people that was wondering whether we should have signed on to it in the first place because it simply was not enough. I didn't like it when it was signed because it is barely better than nothing. when the single most important challenge facing the United States right now is global climate change. And you think these are, the problem of global climate change is a solvable problem. You think about how the United States retooled its industry when we were building up to World War II, when automobile plants stopped making automobiles and started making airplanes, and shipbuilders and trade shipbuilders started making battleships, that if we retooled our industries to start producing solar panels and wind turbines, if we started to really apply ourselves to the technology of wave generation of electricity, we could dramatically change not only our economy, but we could change the future of the planet's environment. What we lack is the moral will to do it. The second thing to consider is that the language of the accord requires a fairly lengthy warning period for any nation to pull out of it. Trump probably doesn't know this, but our withdrawal from the Paris Accord cannot take effect until the fall of 2020. Who here thinks that Trump will be president in the fall of 2020? I got $20 on this, Mark, but I'm saying that there will be another president. Now, whether that next president will take the environmental concerns of our country sufficiently seriously or not, I don't know, but I don't think it's going to rest in his lap 3 years hence. The meaningful conversation may be about why Trump wanted to withdraw from the Paris Accord. He ignorantly trumpets support for the coal industry, though you don't find many people in the coal-producing regions of the world that are standing up and cheering. I come from coal country, and I can tell you a couple of things about coal country. The first being that there's not a single miner today who wants his son or daughter to join him in the mines. There is no one that hates their own children enough to want them to live in that dangerous and horrible environment. It's nasty work. And secondly, it's no longer a good living. There's not a single labor union coal miner in the state of Kentucky. Not one. That what used to be at least a pretty good paying job with certain job securities, they are not that kind of job anymore. And when pressed, even coal executives acknowledge that coal jobs are not coming back. The demand for coal is going down as there are cheaper alternatives, and what few demands there still are on coal mining is being done through automation. There's just not many jobs left in that field. Already, the real employment is shifting to renewable energy industries, where there's already, I believe, 3 times as many people employed in making solar panels and wind turbines as are going into the coal mines at this time. So it's an industry that is on its way out no matter what. Winston Churchill's family ought to get a commission for every time he's quoted as having said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing when they've exhausted all other opportunities. I think that, or all other options. I think the larger truth is that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing when the right thing becomes profitable. The oil and coal industry have held this nation hostage for a century. We should have been switching to mass transit and renewable energy, but the future is going to be determined by the marketplace, not by morality so much, but by the marketplace as wind and solar energy becomes more affordable, and the environmental hazards of coal and oil will be replaced. Sadly, however, having a very uninformed president at the helm in a time of great economic changes like we're facing means that we will not reap the windfall from this change in technology. We are bound and gagged and tied up in the back seat of the 19th century while China gears up to produce the world's solar panels and wind turbines. Even here in town, some of the most exemplary people that have put up large solar arrays, every single unit manufactured in China. Trump is driving America towards both isolation and poverty. And what's maddening is that he's doing it with an ignorant grin on his face. The only people who are happy about the events of this week are the nationalists, the isolationists, the America First or America Only frightened faction of our country. But sadly, this is not just a tiny fragment of our society. Nationalism is of a piece, it's of the same cloth as racism or tribalism. It's akin to partisanship or homophobia or religious exclusivism. We see it exhibited in the deranged man on the train in Portland who stands shouting at two dark-skinned women who were clearly Muslim, yelling at them because he feels like his role in society is threatened by their presence. And two brave men that jumped up to those women's defense were killed in the process of defending them. But we also see it in the tragic bombing in Birmingham, in which a native of Great Britain killed children from his own neighborhood because he is outraged about the way his Muslim relatives are being killed indiscriminately in the Middle East. It's still tribalism. It was a Brit killing Brits because he identified more closely with his heritage that comes where we are sending out drone strikes. Now, I'm aware that I have benefited in very many ways from white privilege. But I want to see the institutions that perpetuate white privilege dismantled. I don't think white privilege was ever fair, and it shouldn't continue. But Donald Trump appeals to people who see their white privilege as being diminished, and they are scared to death. And they want to do whatever they can to hold on to the vestiges of what they perceive as their inherited, God-given, rightful privilege or power. Now, these are two different ways of seeing the world. Neil deGrasse Tyson has, with almost Buddhist clarity, if I can say it that way, said that we are all connected. We're connected to each other biologically, we're connected to the earth chemically, and we're connected to the universe atomically. But our president wants to deny that level of connection. He wants to deny the fact that radiation from a failed nuclear plant in Japan is now affecting people that live on the west coast of the United States, or that burning coal in Springfield, Missouri affects South Pacific islands that are now going under a rising tide. Today is Pentecost in the common Christian calendar, and Paul read that traditional Pentecost text from the second chapter of Acts, in which Luke takes considerable literary privilege to describe an entirely fictional event. But it's a very symbolic event in which the friends of Jesus were suddenly able to speak the languages of dozens of different nations. It's a symbol of unity. Not really global unity, because everybody there was a righteous Jew. It's not, but still, you're not going to be surprised to hear me say that religion often divides people. But in this case, Luke is trying to write this narrative in a way that says this new take on the Jewish faith. I don't think Luke envisioned that Christianity was a thing, but at least envisioning that the followers of Jesus were going to try to unite people rather than divide people. It's a debate that is carried on ferociously within the pages of the Bible, and any reader of the Old Testament can see that at least a third of what is in the Old Testament are rules that are intended to keep the Jews from being assimilated. That they had a particular dietary code, they had certain haircuts, they had certain clothing, they had certain traditions that were to keep them from being drug into and lost among the religions and tribes of their neighbors that were bigger and stronger. They wanted to preserve their sense of themselves as a race and a religion. And so they refused intermarrying, and they oftentimes justified killing, when necessary, any rivals to their heritage. So it'd be nice to think that the theology of the New Testament entirely repudiated that Jewish sectarian, nationalist, racist, Zionist, exclusivist perspective. And sometimes it did, Acts chapter 2, yeah, but there's a debate in the Bible where the prophet Isaiah sees Israel uniting the world in a common way of seeing each other. Ezra and Nehemiah said, you hear somebody speaking something other than Hebrew, just go ahead and beat them up and pull their hair out right where you see them. But even in the Gospels, there's debate. You see it expressed sometimes even in the subtle editing. In the oldest of our canonical Gospels, Mark quotes Jesus as rebuking his disciples for trying to draw too narrowly who is and who is not a follower of Jesus. And he has Jesus saying in chapter 9 of Mark, those who are not against us are for us. That is, unless they've just set themselves up against us, let's not buy any new enemies. Matthew, 30 years later, is copying Mark and editing it sometimes only very slightly, but he changes that sentence entirely. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, he has Jesus saying, whoever is not with me is against me. You see, Mark's trying to be inclusive 30 years later when the competition between Jews and Christians had intensified. Matthew wants to say anybody that's not a member of our club is a bad person. Luke edits Mark in a way that includes more women and more Gentiles, and he wants to give us a Jesus who is more inclusive. 2 generations later, someone writes the Gospel of John, in which even a casual observer has to acknowledge that there is a great deal of anti-Semitism shot through the entire telling of the Jesus narrative in John. Now, President Trump wants you to be afraid of Muslims so that we can ban them from our country. He wants you to be afraid of Mexicans so that we can spend billions of dollars on a border wall. And he wants you to be afraid of science because he's an idiot. But I digress. There may have been a time in human history in which tribalism served our survival interests. The them or us thinking may have helped the Jews to survive, and you got to admit, we all still know some Jews, but we don't know many Hittites, Hivites, or Jebusites, do we? So there was a time in history when it worked. The more vulnerable may be afraid that immigrants will take their jobs or that terrorists might sneak in among the refugees. But beyond all the fears that rise out of our primitive brainstems, our modern awareness must affirm that there is no more survival of one group by extinguishing rival tribes. We are all in this together. We are all connected. When the DAPL pipeline leaks, and folks, it will leak, and it will leak into the Missouri River, it won't be just the Sioux Indian tribe that gets contaminated water. It will be millions of us. When we belch coal smoke into the air, it's not just the children of the poor that get asthma. When sea levels rise from melting polar ice caps, it's not just coastal areas that will be affected because the sequestered methane in the ice in those polar caps will find its way even to you that live on mountaintops. Being concerned about the environment is a choice. It's a choice of being concerned about how the impact of how I live my life will have an effect on other people, many of whom have not yet been born. Donald Trump is trying to manipulate this nation by appealing to our most primitive fears. What we as a spiritual community are trying to do is to appeal to our highest thinking and the very best and noble character that human beings are capable of reaching. I'm asking you to plant trees whose fruit you will never eat and under whose shade you will never sit. I'm asking you to think of your grandchildren and great-grandchildren who won't be born for years to come. I'm asking you to think of the foreigner whose language you do not understand and whose religion is unsavory to you as also being a part of who you are. Henry Nouwen repeated a Hasidic tradition about rabbis taught students in rabbinic schools by a question and answer kind of Platonic style. And the rabbi asked his students, how do you determine when night ends and day begins in terms of keeping Sabbath? And when is a day officially a new day or starting over? And one of the students said, when in the distance you can tell the difference between a dog and a sheep, the dawn has come. And another guessed, when you can tell the difference between a fig tree and a grapevine. And the rabbi said, no, it is when you can look into the face of another human being and there is enough light in you to recognize that that person is your brother or your sister. And until that time comes, it is still nighttime. Folks, we need to dispel the darkness of division and fear and bring enough light into the world so that we can recognize Syrian refugees as our children, so that we can realize that Muslims and Jews and Catholics and Buddhists and Hindus are all struggling to find a path towards meaning and purpose, and their beliefs do not take anything from our beliefs. We need to be able to look into the faces of that song we used to sing, red and yellow, black and white. It was never about Jesus, it's about you. You need to be able to have enough light in you to see that those are your brothers and your sisters. And until we can do that, it's still nighttime.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.